Hi, today's video is a little bit different. I recently got asked for an interesting request, which was how can I use automation to speed up certain tasks in DaVinci Resolve. I got reached out by a person named, or an individual named Dan Barstow, who works in science and education, and he happens to have a very huge catalog of image sequences, specifically high-resolution photos from the International Space Station. Many astronauts take pictures using high-resolution cameras as the ISS orbits around the Earth. And these are beautiful sequences that he transforms into footage that he then uses in multiple beautiful ways, including to promote science and education. And since the ISS has started sending this footage to him, some digital, some even film, he has developed quite a large backlog of footage. And so his main issue, and what he asked me to help him with, is figure out a way to use scripting and automation to help transcode and manage all this data, all this footage. I do have to give a shout out to Alex Centeno. He does have a few great YouTube videos specifically about using DaVinci Resolve and Python, and it's a great place to start. I definitely learned a lot from him how to set up things correctly, but there is a lot that is also not that well documented. And I think this is because your average DaVinci Resolve user, whether you're a full-time professional or you're more of a prosumer perhaps, automation is not really needed. DaVinci Resolve has a lot of powerful pre-built tools that can solve a lot of those issues. And I think using Python or Lua scripting is more used by either a really large post-production companies or even boutique post-production companies for more backlog work, or back-end I should say, work. And so because of that, there's a lot of experimentation and detective work that I needed to do to get the results that I did. And I am definitely not an expert in any kind of scripting or coding, Python, HTML, or C++, whatever. So if anyone is looking at these videos sees a way to optimize the code, I'd love to hear from you, because I am learning as I go. But I do think the more I'm learning about this, the more I can see how even prosumers and more casual users can really benefit from automation and using Python scripting to both improve or just speed up your workflow. Or also for archival purposes. I could see this being really useful and powerful tool to manage not just existing projects, but old projects you might have lying around that you wish you could somehow consolidate or compress and so forth. Anyway, I'll stop here and I'll transition to the actual tutorial, and yeah, thank you for watching. In this video, I want to walk through the process I took to automate some functions in DaVinci Resolve, and that is to point to a specific folder, grab all the footage from that folder, in this case image sequences, ingest them into DaVinci Resolve with the exact settings we want, and then apply some additional settings to them like Optical Flow, and then queue them up for render, start the render in a specific file path that we can add. And if we don't have a specific file path in mind, it just defaults to the user's desktop. And we're doing this all with Python. And to set this up, there's a couple steps we need to do. And so I will first go to my desktop. This looks like a lot, but what I'm essentially showing first, I want you to pay attention to, is this document here, this little setup guide I created. And to make sure everything works, to make sure Python, or excuse me, the terminal knows where to look for Python and where to look for the APIs from DaVinci Resolve, we need to make sure we set up everything correctly. So first, we're going to install Python using Homebrew. And Homebrew is a command that you can use in terminal. It's a package manager that allows you to install different additional programs for your Mac. If you're more familiar with working in Linux, you know that there's a lot of power and utility in installing things through the command line, through the terminal, versus using DMG, or if you're on Windows, exe files. And it just gives you a lot more transparency on what's going on and how you can tweak it. If you already do run scripts using Homebrew, you might run into an issue, which is, let's say you installed Homebrew and then you've upgraded macOS 1 or 2 versions, and you haven't updated Homebrew since. You might run into an issue where it'll give you an error or something like Xcode is missing or something along those lines. You can update Xcode using the this command line, install it if it's missing entirely, if you have a really old version. Or you can use the App Store to download it too. I prefer the terminal line, but this is another option. So essentially, first what we'll do is install Homebrew, and you can either copy this line and paste it into terminal and just run it as is. It should install just fine. If you do get that error, then yes, you first have to run the line Xcode. Once you have Homebrew installed, you can easily run the following command, which is brew install Python, and then at the version you want. For the latest versions of DaVinci Resolve, anything 3.6 or higher should work fine. In this case, we're running 3.12, but whether you run 3.11, 0.8, I think is actually the version I'm running, or 3.12 or 3.8, it doesn't matter. It will work in DaVinci Resolve. So we have it already installed, so we don't need to do that command either. And the next thing you want to do is, once you have Python installed using Brew, you want to make sure that your terminal knows where to look for Python on your computer, and also knows where to look for DaVinci Resolve on your computer. And you can do that through your bash profile, which is a document that sits in your user's default or home directory, and you can load that into terminal to make sure it knows where everything is. To create that, it's really easy. You can use a simple text edit document and go to your user default location. In my case, is just my name. And in there, you'll have folders like documents, movies, downloads, all your defaults, and maybe some install files. But you won't see the hidden files. So if you press Command-Shift-, it should show you all your hidden files. And one of them will be .bash_profile. If you don't see it, it's not an issue. You just have to create it from scratch. You just have to make sure that when you go to create a new text document using text edit, or in this case, I'm using Sublime Text, it doesn't actually matter. You just make sure when you go to save as, you save it as .bash_profile in this location. As for what you put inside the file, we have ours already open, and you can copy paste this. And what this does is it shows you where Homebrew has installed Python, so terminal knows where to look for it. And it also shows you where the default DaVinci Resolve APIs go, so that terminal knows where to pull those from as well when it's running your Python scripts. And once you've done that, copy pasted that, created this bash profile, you hit save, and we move on to the next step. And for the next step, we have to load this bash profile into a terminal window. So if you copy paste that, you hit enter, it has now been loaded into terminal. And the way to test if it works is you can simply run this command, Python, see the version, and it will list your version. So if it is able to run this command and then show you that what version of Python you are running, you know that it's working. So then we clear the terminal. And now that we have set that up, we can actually run our own custom Python scripts. Now, for DaVinci Resolve, it's The script I have is right here. I just called it DVR script test version 20 because I've been iterating, trying to figure things out. And there's a couple things in the script that don't work without you having DaVinci Resolve already loaded and changing some default settings in DaVinci Resolve. So if I were to open this script, here it is. There's a lot going on here, as you can see. It might look like a lot, but it actually is pretty simple. Once you get to know where things are. At first, it's very overwhelming. But at the beginning, you're just telling DaVinci, running Python where the DaVinci Resolve APIs are, and eventually you you get to DaVinci Resolve's project manager, you set up a project, the settings you want, the resolution, frame rate, and things like that. Then you go to tell where you want DaVinci Resolve to look for the media, where it's importing it from. And finally, you set the settings for the clips within each timeline. And finally, you export everything with the settings you want. This is, we'll go into more detail, but that's the quick run through. Unfortunately, the documentation for running Lua or Python, which are the languages supported by DaVinci Resolve, isn't fully fleshed out. I don't think that many users are using it. Maybe some boutique or bigger post-production companies might use some of these scripts for some back-end work, but it's not something I think a lot of users use. And so the documentation on it is quite limited. And so it does take some detective work and some digging and some experimentation to get things running correctly. And some language, even though the logic works, the actual behavior of how the program runs, there are some conflicts. And one of those is actually the default frame rate for ingested image sequences. So as you can see here, I have set the timeline and playback frame rate at 30 because I want the sequences, the image sequences I import into DaVinci Resolve to be at 30. But no matter what settings I do, it'll always default to 24. And at first I thought this was an issue where if you use DaVinci Resolve normally, let's say you have it loaded, you open it up, and you go to grab this clip from the media storage, I thought maybe it's defaulting to 24 frames per second here. And when it gets dragged into here, you're usually asked by DaVinci Resolve, you get a prompt that says, hey, your project is at 30 frames per second, but your image sequence is at 24. Do you want to change it to 24 to match? And you would either click yes or no. And so I assumed the default language or the default option when running code was always yes. And that's what was causing that change. But that wasn't actually the case. The project itself stayed at 30, but the image sequences always interpreted at 24. And when I tested the same with a video file that was at 30 frames per second, it did not do that issue. So it's clearly something about how DaVinci Resolve was defaulting interpreting image sequences. And unfortunately, none of the API documents had a solution for this. So the way I was able to work around it is before you run the script the first time for a batch sequence, you go into your master settings, you make sure you set your timeline and playback frame rate and your video format all to having 30 frames per second. And then you go into your default preset, load preset, and you make sure, in this case I'm doing 4K, so that's why this changed. And once you have all the settings you want to make sure you press on set current settings as default preset. And if you do that, it will now by default interpret all image sequences at the correct 30 frames per second. So unfortunately, at the moment of the recording of this video, that's the only way I was able to get this script to work because it ignores the default setting only for image sequences. So that was one setting that we need to make sure we set. But once you set that as a default, you can run the rest of the code just fine. So if we were to run the code, what the code does is it looks for the folder we point to, the file path. So if I look at the code, let me go here. It's going to look for a specific file path. In this case, this project folder media is what I pasted in here. And what it's going to do is it's going to look for every file and subfolder as well in that location and import that into the project, which it does here. And now it correctly interprets them all at 30 frames per second, which matches our project settings, which are created in the script. And like this, it'll create a sequence from this. So right now I'm going to do that manually just to show you, and it'll create a sequence. We'll open the sequence. And the next thing, if I look at this, you can see that it doesn't have black bars, but the original footage does. And the way this is done is you can either zoom in on the timeline at the exact point you want it, or you go into your settings and you make sure that you have full frame with crop selected. This is another setting similar to the frame rate of the ingested clip that doesn't always stick. It does sometimes, but it doesn't always stick. So because in our case, I know that all this image sequences are the same high resolution photographs from the ISS, I was able to calculate that to go from having black bars to a full frame with crop, I needed to zoom in by 1.2. And so it's just making sure if this setting doesn't stick, down here under clip attributes, hold on. I lost my setting here. I make sure that each individual sequence, each individual clip in each sequence has the setting of zoom X and Y set to 1.2. Another request was, in the case of image sequences, it was to apply optical flow because these are individual photos. We wanted it to have really smooth playback. Here it's not actually running in real time. But if I were to play back the clip, here I have the rendered version of that. Let me go. There we go. Its playback is very smooth, even though these are all image sequences. And we're doing that using optical flow. And so usually what you do is you right click on an image, you go to clip attributes, which is right here, and you'd have to change it here. But recently there was an update in DaVinci Resolve, well actually a few updates ago, and they changed it to down here, retime and scaling. Sometimes you won't even see it because it'll be either disabled or enabled, but minimized. So if you open this up, you'll have all these settings here. And so what you have to do is click on retime process and select optical flow. So at first I thought I could code this as option 4, so retime process and then option 4, but actually the logic in DaVinci Resolve goes, it starts from not 1 but 0. So option 0 would be the same as the project settings, which is usually frame blend or whatever your default is. Whereas option 3 is optical flow. So I select that, and that allows for smoother image once you export, smoother image sequence. And so again, you can see that in the code. If we go down here, clip set property retime process 3, and it makes sure that it will do it for each individual clip in its own timeline. And eventually what it'll do is it'll add the timeline to the render queue to a file path you choose. And if you don't have a file path in mind, you just hit enter, it'll default to your desktop. So now I'm going to go back here and I'm going to run the script, and it'll just do everything I just went through, but through the script. So I'm going to show you the terminal. I'm going to go here and go to my test scripts, and this is the script I want to run. I can either write cd and then copy paste the file path, mount the file path, and then name the file path, and then name the file in that location. Or in this case, I'm just going to drag and drop, and it does both. And then all I have to do is hit enter, and then it'll ask for a project name. In this case, I'm just using a default of 8.2, just to go up one version. And here you can see it creates the project, it loads the media into the media pool, and then it will ask what's the output path. So this, again, as you can see, if you press enter, it'll just default to your desktop. But you can also, for example, put it in a render folder of your choosing. So I here have on my SMB share a render folder. So if I drag that in here, hit enter, it will export all the media to that location. So here it generated 3 timelines with the correct settings with Optical Flow, and it's going to go ahead and immediately start rendering them. So if I were to open this folder, you can see here it's starting to populate. So while that's rendering in the background, you can, of course, change these settings where the default is. I just chose desktop because in case you hit enter by accident, you can't find the clips. It'll be very obvious that it's on your desktop, but you can make that default an external drive. And the way you do that is you go to right here. You can change that default to whatever you want. And here we can see the second clip finished rendering. We're now on the 3rd clip. It's almost done. And we can open one of these clips in QuickTime. And you can see with Optical Flow, it runs smoothly, and we can see that it is at 30 frames per second, and the resolution we want it to be in H.264. Now, if we want to change it to H.265, which is more compressed, you can once again go in the code, find the setting for H.265, which is right there. You just choose the codec, keep it at MP4. I find that works better, and run the code again, and it will make sure that every single file or image sequence you put in that folder, we export it as an H.265 or H.264 in this case. And here it has rendered all these clips, and again, you can go back to the project, which is right here, and here it imported the files in the media pool 1, 2, 3. It created individual sequence for each of the files, and if we were to look at any one of them, if you select the file, you can see it applied the zoom 1.2. If I go to 1, oh great. Aha, well, that's good to know. So there's Optical Flow applied correctly, but here we actually have a mistake. It says that zoom is at 1.2, but if we go to 1.1, it zooms out. So this is kind of the issue I was talking about, how sometimes you have to double up on settings, but there's issues with that because now that we set our project default, if we go to image scaling to scale full frame with crop, the 1.2 zoom action is not necessary. So if that's actually good, we can reduce one of the settings. But if you wanted to customize the setting, you could do that. So let's go ahead and change that. So I'm going to change it from 1.2 back to 1.0 because we don't need to change that. Because now that we set the default, actually just save it as is. Why is it not? Okay, I'll just save it as test 21. That's fine. So like this, again, when we right click and we go to default setting, set current setting as default, what we did is we also checked this setting, scale full frame with crop. And so we don't need to apply the zoom. If, however, you want to customize it more, you can use the zoom option. I personally prefer using input scaling because Not every single image sequence might be the same size, so I just like that no matter what different resolutions all your separate image sequences are, it will adjust it by filling it in with crop. So let's try running that code again. So I'll put these in a new folder and call it batch 01. So these new clips should be, instead of 1.2 like this, they should be just like that. For example, this timeline here, if I click on that, yeah, it should be like that. So let's try that now. So same thing as before, we're going to clear the terminal, make sure we have loaded the bash profile, and you can click clear. And then we'll go into our Finder. In this case, we'll run a new script. Oh, hold on, I named it wrong. There, prefer that. I'll quickly, just for my own notation, change that. And so now that we have the default setting set to full frame, we can run this. In this case, we'll call the file A3 since we already took A2. Here it goes, it creates the A3. And in this case, we can try rendering through the same location as before. So if I go to test scripts, rent folder, I'll do that. And actually, rent folder, I'm going to add batch 03. So I'll save there. Actually, why is it batch 2? It should be batch 2. And this we can change back to batch 1. And now it should fill them correctly. Let's see. Here it goes. That looks better. We'll wait for this file to finish. But then we can compare, make sure it's zooming correctly. So here it seems to be too zoomed in. Okay, clip 1 should be done. Go up. Make sure we're at the start. And yes, you can see here it's pushed in too far, and here it's pushed in correctly. So that's great to know. And that default setting, you now don't have to use the zoom setting, but I'll still keep it in this code. So in case there is anything that needs to be customized, maybe one time when they shot it, they several image sequences, for whatever reason, it was a different camera. Maybe it was Canon instead of a Nikon. You can use this zoom setting as to over or under correct the simple zoom in scale. And so now if we go back, we can double check it did everything correctly. And yes, you can see each image sequence has optical flow selected to the clip. You have to make sure you're hovering over the clip. So it shows that it's optical flow selected. And yes, zoom is now 1.0. If I go to 0.9, you'll see black bars. If I go to 1.2, it'll be the same as before. So yeah, now that was fun. We problem solved together. But yeah, so that's how you can set up a project to use Python with DaVinci Resolve. I hope you find this useful, and it'll allow you to create all sorts of beautiful image sequences, or just help you manage all your media quickly and efficiently. Hope this video helped.